Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I am Jordan Steffaniak, president of the London Lyceum and host of Kiffin's Keep, and as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering the topic of divine impassibility, and I'm going to give you some reasons why I think you should believe it is true and why I think it is true. Before we get into the video, do remember to like the video if you enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, and then drop a comment if you agree, disagree, or if you think I missed anything. As a reminder, do like the video. The last two videos I've done, apparently no one's liked them, no one's watched them. 2 videos ago, I have 1 like. So that tells me that apparently I didn't talk about a topic that's very interesting, or maybe you just didn't like the content. So hopefully this one's pretty good. Anyway, let's go ahead and get to it. So I was planning on doing a video on 4 reasons why you should believe divine impassibility is true. And then I read a short little online article that was rejecting divine impassibility. And I thought, wow, this is perfect. So I can talk a little bit about this, some potential misunderstandings, and lead you into why you should accept it. So this is from Sam Storms, who I guess it's on his website, samstorms.org. So I'll drop a link in the description so you can go check it out if you want to and read it. It's part of, I guess, his top books or something series of posts. And it was about Kevin DeYoung's book, Daily Doctrine. And it's kind of weird because he's recommending the book to go buy it. But the 99% of it is disagreements with 2 different pieces. One of them was about miracles, which interesting in itself, I guess. The one that interested me was his disagreement with divine impassibility. So I'll start there and work my way through it. So he begins by saying, first, I simply cannot embrace the traditional notion of the impassibility of God. And my initial reaction anytime I hear that or read that or see that is to say, what is the traditional notion? Let's get clear on what we're talking about here. And so then he does follow up saying, if by denying that God suffers, he means that God is not affected, displeased, or angry in the presence of human sin and idolatry, I must disagree. And so that is an important claim that he's making. And I think he's misunderstanding what the traditional doctrine of impassibility is. And now, to be fair, the proponents of divine impassibility, I think, misunderstand it oftentimes. And some of the difficulty ends up becoming conceptual slippage based on the terms that people are using and what they mean by these different terms. So emotion is notoriously a slippery term because you don't find emotion in any of the old writers because that term didn't exist. That was invented, the 18th or 19th century with sort of the advent of modern psychology. And psychologists wanted to have a term that could take away the sort of religious flavor of the older terms like passion and affection and those sort of things. And so they came up with emotion. And that doesn't necessarily correspond to any of these older terms. And so it gets confusing and hairy when we do this. But there's a couple of questions we should ask when we come to this, and that need to be separated. It's not just like, can we predicate anger of God in some sense? Can we say that he's displeased with sinners in some sense? I think everybody's going to say that that's true. But there's a couple of diagnostic questions you could ask. Things like, can God be moved? Does God have emotions? And by emotions, I mean a broad bucketed term that would include affections, that would include things like joy and love. And then you also have that it would include passions that are like violent motions of the bodily motions that are against the will, as well as other sort of, I guess, what we call emotions today. And then you would have to ask, what kind of, if you can have emotions, what kind of emotions does then God have? Could he have any sort of morally upright emotion? Could he feel despair if it's appropriately directed? Can he only feel joy? Can he feel love? Those sort of things. And then you have questions of like, can God's emotions change? And when you start bracketing these questions out, that can then really narrow down where it is that there's actually disagreement. Because the synopsis of pure theology, for example, is going to say that God's good affections and the virtues of his intellect and will are truth, love, goodness, gentleness, charity, generosity, mercy, and long-suffering, anger, hatred, justice, and also holiness, and are truly and properly said of God. So right here we have a clear statement saying that these things are truly and properly said of God. And of course it says, and of course, with the removal of every imperfection from them, they're nothing other than God's ardent will toward us and its power and effects in creatures. So the proper sort of qualifications. But where in here do you see them denying that God has love and justice and hatred and holiness? No, he does. It's just having to properly understand how they're couched in the proper sense. So that's why I think Sam gets a little confused here, because he goes on to say this. He says, but nowhere does scripture say that God's anger or feelings of pity or pleasure refer to something other than real anger, pity, or pleasure. In other words, there is no further truth in mind when we say God feels delight. It simply means he feels delight. End quote. That is a severely, what's the right word? Uh, Flat-footed and thin reading of Scripture and understanding of how things are predicated of God. And that's going to get you in a lot of trouble. If you want to read and interpret Scripture that way, then you are going to have to read all of the other traditional anthropomorphisms in the same way. What is it that's going to distinguish when you're allowed to say, well, arm is actually referring to some is metaphorical in some sense, rock is metaphorical in some sense, it's getting at this meaning, versus these other things. Uh, Nothing corresponds completely in all respects from how a human would experience and understand something to where God, who is spirit, would understand and experience something. And so this sort of one-to-one correlation, just this flat-footed approach, I think is really problematic, and it ends up getting you into trouble. And I think we can say, affirming divine impassibility, everything that is concerning to somebody like Sam, because I think it's natural and right to say, well, I see this in Scripture, and I want to be able to say that God does experience this. Because if I don't, then it seems like, what am I actually reading in the Bible if there isn't some sense in which this is true of God, where he's righteously angry at sin, or he's passionately loving and forgiving? If I can't say that, it seems like, who actually is God? And no, we can say those things truly and appropriately with the proper and necessary qualifications of the creator creature distinction, these various things. And it's just a matter of being careful with how we speak of God, which I think is an appropriate sort of posture. Now, Sam does go on to quote Charles Spurgeon, who he says clearly did not believe in divine impassibility as it's currently being espoused. And of course, maybe what he has in reference currently being espoused, maybe that's true. The Spurgeon quote, I think it's relevant, but there's things about Spurgeon's quote that you've got to get clear. Number one, Spurgeon is a preacher, and he's preaching with typical rhetorical flourish. And so I would not expect and anticipate him to be as sort of precise as is really necessary when it comes to specifically impassibility. And nothing he says in that entire sermon, you can go find it online, go Google it. I'll drop a link, I guess, to it so you can look in the description so you can take a look. Nothing in there, to my mind, is directly opposed to a proper doctrine of divine impassibility. It gets a little slippery at points, but I would expect and anticipate that in a sermon of somebody like Spurgeon's stature and how he would preach. I'd anticipate some slippage there, and that doesn't bother me. I would imagine if he were to write a treatise on it, he'd be more careful. So there's nothing in there that's purely against it, because he even says, where the main point is just that Jehovah, he says this, Jehovah is not insensible. He's the living God, and everything that goes with life, pure, perfect, holy life, is to be found in him. And so he wants to say that everything, joy, all these things are truly and properly said of God. And Thomas Aquinas is going to say joy is truly and properly predicated of God. So that's I think the main idea and focus of what he's trying to say is consistent with divine impassibility. So I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why you should believe it. I'm not going over all the objections that are out there. There's plenty of objections. You can go find a bunch of papers out there that are objecting to a doctrine of divine impassibility. I think oftentimes they're objecting to one particular version of divine impassibility, and that has other sort of fatal flaws that are associated with it. So this isn't going to cover every single objection that's out there. Like I said, there's lots of papers that are out there. There's lots of books that are out there that are going to object to various aspects of divine impassibility. I think oftentimes they're objecting to a specific type, and they're objecting. Now, they're going to say that there's only one type of divine impassibility. There's not really degrees in it. It's either all or nothing. I don't think that's the case. I think that if you use these fine-grained distinctions and these questions, that it can be helpful to adjudicate the various versions of divine impassibility, because a lot of people who want to reject divine impassibility are going to read something like the Synopsis of Pure Theology and say, that's not consistent with divine impassibility. Well, of course it is. Of course it is, because that's a traditional doctrinal statement on what it means. And it's just you want it to mean something else, and it doesn't. So I'm going to give you a couple of reasons. I'm going to give you 4 reasons I think you should believe it. Number 1, I start with the Bible. And I think that's an appropriate place to start for all doctrinal formulation. You don't always have to start with the Bible. There's not sort of an epistemic rule that says if you don't start with the Bible, then you're going to get it wrong. Some people, you build all sorts of ideas. You might hear it from a sermon. You might hear it from your friend. There's all sorts of ways that you might learn of something and come to a belief prior to the Bible. And now the Bible is the final authority for all matters of faith and practice, but it doesn't mean there's always going to be the first in the line of sort of like the order of knowing. Now it's the proper best place to start, but that's for another topic. So I'm just going to start here. And I think there's a couple of texts that I like to reference. One of those would be Romans 9:5, where Paul calls God blessed forever, which to me is the motivating logic for divine impassibility. God is forever blessed, eternally, consistently, immutably, constantly. And because of this, he can never experience suffering. For suffering is not the object of blessedness, but of torment. And so similarly, we're going to have something like Romans 11 again, 33 through 36, where Paul's doxology talks about the depth and riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. And it applies Job 41:11 to the divine. So he says, "For who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things." I think these texts are ultimately leading us to divine impassibility. They may not be explicit texts. Of course, we don't have explicit texts for all sorts of things. You have to be willing to make inferences from text to understand how doctrinal formulation works. So likewise, I think James 1:13 entails a doctrine of divine impassibility. God cannot be tempted. The reason he cannot be tempted is because he's beyond suffering. He's not able to receive those sorts of actions. He can't be acted upon to receive any source of temptation. James 1:17 offers the positive side of immutability. As James writes, he says, "Every good and gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." So as the benevolent source of all that is good, and the one that cannot be tempted, God transcends all these suffering things as indescribably rich. He's sharing his goodness with all. And I think that's just fundamentally what the text of Scripture is going to teach us and tell us. I think there's a couple of theological sort of arguments to defend this as well. I would start with something like what I would call the blessedness argument of some sort, where you'd start with, if someone is blessed forever, then they cannot experience suffering. And since God is blessed forever, therefore God cannot experience suffering. So if you want to deny that, you're going to have to push back against the idea that if someone's blessed forever, then they could experience suffering. Is there a sense in which you could be blessed forever and experience suffering at some point? If you say yes, then maybe that argument doesn't work, but I don't think that's the case. I think everybody would say that the pinnacle of blessedness is the lack of suffering. Another argument could be that spirit and passions are unmixed. And so if let's say if X is immaterial, then X cannot have passions. And since God is immaterial, therefore God cannot have passions. And now that there though is making a distinction between passions and affections and other types of things. It's denying passions of God. It's not necessarily denying affections. And I think you can predicate affections of God and still uphold divine impassibility. In fact, I think that's the normal traditional model of divine impassibility. If you read the historical witness, that is more the consistent theme. That's not always the case. There are others who have more stronger accounts of divine impassibility. I just don't think they're the majority report. And even if they were, I don't think that they are the necessary report, that you must do this to affirm divine impassibility. The third argument would simply be I would call it the goodness argument. If X suffers, then X would lack some good. So this is similar to the blessedness argument. It says God never lacks any good. God cannot suffer. And so then you have to ask yourself the question, is it possible for something to suffer and to lack some, or I guess to not lack some good? And you want to say that, well, God, of course, never lacks any good. And so I think these sorts of arguments fundamentally buttress the idea of divine impassibility. So, number one, the Bible, and these other three, the blessedness, the spirit and passions, and then the goodness sort of argument. I think these are good reasons to say that divine impassibility is true. And that's not saying anything for the historical witness. That's not saying anything for any of the potential objections. That's just simply saying right here, I think divine impassibility has good reasons going for it. So let me know what you guys think. Are there other reasons that you would say divine impassibility is true? Do you want to use these to defend it? Do you think that I've articulated things properly or improperly? You think there's some sort of fatal objection that you want me to deal with in some future video that you think is important? And by the way, if you're watching this, yes, my shelf is missing books over here. And that's because they broke, because I apparently have too many books and it's not built for that. A bookshelf's not built for books. So he's supposed to come by. Yeah, all the books are over here now. And he's supposed to come back by and fix it and give me better things to hold all the books that I have. But in the meantime, it looks kind of lame. But anyway, I appreciate you guys tuning in. And yeah, let me know about the past few videos. So if you're a regular watcher, regular listener, whatever you are, go back and listen to the last 2 or 3 and give me some feedback. Say, yes, this was helpful. No, that's not helpful. I don't like this sort of content. I do this for you guys. I don't do this for myself. Well, I mean, sometimes it's helpful for me to talk through things and think through things, but I continue to do these things because others watch them and find them valuable. So if you could give me some feedback and let me know, yes, this is useful. No, this is not useful, or talk more about this, or I have questions about this. I like doing this to be able to serve and help others, to use the gifts that I've been given and the experience and the training that I've been given to serve others. Because I know in my own experience growing up and learning and maturing and being trained, I've always valued others who are further along the path or at different stages of the path or at different paths to share their wisdom with me. Not saying that I have a bunch of wisdom, but it's always been helpful to have others who talk about these sort of things to learn from. So let me know what you guys think. I do appreciate you all tuning in and listening or watching, whatever method you do it. I don't know which is the most popular, but if you're listening, or jump on YouTube and drop a comment or something like that. Anyway, I appreciate you all tuning in to Kiffin's Keep, and I look forward to picking with you all soon.